A soft winter breeze carried dust down the narrow street where the small repair shop stood. Inside, the mechanic wiped the grease from his hands after finishing a long day of work. The shop was not big, but it was enough for him to earn a living and keep his family going. His life had never been easy, yet he carried himself with quiet strength. He did not complain, even when his boss barked orders or when the hours stretched long into the evening. What mattered most to him was the dignity of work and the small pride he felt every time he fixed something that others thought was beyond repair. That day, just as he was about to close the doors, the sound of creaking wheels caught his attention. Slowly, an elderly woman pushed a bicycle into the shop. The bike looked as worn out as she did. Her hands trembled slightly and her steps were heavy, but she forced a gentle smile. She explained softly that her bicycle had broken down on the way home and she had no idea how to fix it. The mechanic noticed her thin jacket and tired eyes. She looked as if life had not been kind to her in recent years. He bent down and examined the bike. The chain was loose, the brakes worn, and one of the tires had nearly given up. He could tell that this old lady depended on the bike for her daily needs, probably even for buying groceries or visiting a nearby doctor. She spoke carefully, almost embarrassed, and admitted that she didn't have money with her to pay for the repair. Her voice carried both shame and worry, as if she feared being turned away. The mechanic stood there for a moment, thinking about the long list of things his boss expected from him. He knew the rule: no service without payment. His boss had repeated it countless times. Yet, when he looked at the woman's trembling hands resting on the bike handles, his heart softened. It didn't feel right to leave her stranded. He smiled gently and told her not to worry. She looked surprised, almost unsure if she had heard him correctly. He nodded again, reassuring her, and rolled the bike to his workbench. With calm hands he began to work. The tools clinked softly as he tightened the chain and fixed the brakes. He pumped air into the tired wheel and polished the rusty handlebars. While he worked, the woman stood quietly, watching him with watery eyes. She tried to thank him, but her words broke in the middle. She looked like someone who had been through many struggles, someone who had carried burdens far too heavy for her age. The mechanic could sense it, but he kept his focus on repairing the bike. Minutes later, the bicycle looked steady again, ready for the road. The old woman placed her hand gently on the mechanic's shoulder and whispered her gratitude. Tears slipped down her wrinkled cheeks, and she pressed her palms together as though his simple kindness meant the world to her. The mechanic smiled shyly, not wanting to make her feel small. He only said that sometimes we help not because we expect anything, but because it is the right thing to do. The woman wheeled her bike out of the shop, pausing once at the door to look back. Her eyes carried both relief and a kind of silent blessing. For a brief moment, the mechanic felt something he rarely experienced in his daily routine: peace. He had not earned any money from the repair, but he had earned something that felt far greater. What he did not notice, however, was a pair of eyes watching him from the corner of the shop. One of his co-workers had seen everything. The co-worker raised an eyebrow, shook his head, and quietly slipped out of the room. The mechanic didn't think much of it. He believed he had done the right thing, and that was enough for him. He wiped his hands again, switched off the lights, and locked the shop's front door. As he walked home under the fading sky, he carried no pride in his heart, only a quiet sense of satisfaction. Life was never easy for him, but tonight he felt lighter. He thought about the old woman pedaling slowly down the street, her bike steady again, her worries lifted just a little. He did not know who she truly was, nor what ripple his small act of kindness would create in the days to come. For him, it was just a simple choice: help someone in need, even if it cost him something. What he did not realize was that this small act, unnoticed by most, would soon change the direction of his life. The road ahead would not be smooth. Trouble was waiting for him at the shop the next morning, and his act of kindness would not be forgotten, neither by those who disapproved, nor by someone far more powerful than he could ever imagine. The next morning, the mechanic walked into the shop with the same quiet routine he always carried. He placed his lunchbox in the corner, tied his work apron, and prepared for another long day. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness the evening before was already stirring trouble. The memory of the old woman's smile still warmed his heart, and he tried not to think about rules or consequences. To him, it had been a small favor for someone in need. But not everyone saw it that way. The boss arrived not long after. He was a man who liked to be in control, his eyes sharp, his words often heavy with criticism. He believed in numbers, profits, and strict order. As soon as he stepped inside, one of the co-workers leaned close and whispered something in his ear. The boss froze for a moment, then his face darkened. He turned his head sharply toward the mechanic, who was bent over a motorbike engine, unaware that his world was about to shift. The boss's voice cut through the air like a blade. He called the mechanic over in front of everyone. The other workers stopped what they were doing, sensing the storm that was about to come. The boss demanded to know if it was true that the mechanic had repaired a bike for free the previous evening. The mechanic straightened up, his hands stained with grease, his face calm. He did not deny it. With honesty, he explained that an elderly woman had come in, clearly struggling, and he could not bring himself to turn her away. Instead of listening, the boss's anger only grew. His voice rose louder, echoing off the walls of the workshop. He accused the mechanic of wasting company time and stealing resources. He claimed the act was foolish and irresponsible. The mechanic tried to explain again, saying it was only a small repair, nothing that cost the shop much, but the boss was not interested in hearing reason. His eyes blazed with pride and stubbornness, as though the very idea of kindness was an insult to his authority. The workers watched silently, some shifting uncomfortably, others lowering their heads. A few admired the mechanic's courage, but no one dared to speak up. Everyone knew the boss's temper and the consequences of crossing him. The mechanic stood firm, not raising his voice, not showing disrespect. He simply said that sometimes helping someone is more important than money. His words were calm, but they carried a weight that made a few of the workers glance at each other with quiet respect. That was the final straw for the boss. Red with fury, he shouted that there was no place for people like him in the shop. Without hesitation, he announced that the mechanic was fired on the spot. The words hung heavy in the air, shocking even those who had expected a punishment. The mechanic stood there for a moment, stunned, the sound of the boss's words echoing in his ears. He thought of his family, of the bills waiting at home, of the uncertain future he now faced. But even as fear crept in, he did not regret what he had done. Slowly, he untied his apron and placed it on the workbench. He looked around the shop one last time, at the tools he had worked with for years, at the co-workers who stood frozen, unsure of what to say. His eyes held no anger, only a quiet dignity. He picked up his lunchbox and walked toward the door. As he stepped outside, the winter air stung his face, but his heart felt strangely calm. He had lost his job, but he had not lost his humanity. Behind him, the shop buzzed again with whispered conversations. Some called him foolish, saying he should have kept quiet and followed the rules. Others shook their heads, feeling guilty for not defending him. And somewhere, deep down, a few of them knew they would remember this moment for a long time. The mechanic walked down the street slowly, each step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. If faced with the same choice again, he would still help the old woman. Kindness, he believed, should never be punished. Yet little did he know that his boss's harsh decision had set into motion something far greater than any of them could imagine. The consequences of his simple act were not finished. In fact, they were only just beginning. That evening, the mechanic walked home with slower steps than usual. The streets felt colder, the noise of passing cars sounded distant, and his mind kept repeating the words that had ended his job, fired, all because he chose to help someone who clearly needed it. He carried his lunchbox under one arm and kept his eyes low, not wanting anyone to see the heaviness on his face. The thought of going home without work, without a paycheck, was harder than the cold air biting against his skin. When he reached his small home, the dim light from the window greeted him. Inside, his children ran to him, their faces bright and innocent, unaware of the storm he carried within. Their laughter eased his heart for a moment. His wife noticed his tired expression, though, and quietly asked what had happened. He sat down at the small wooden table and told her everything: the old woman, the repair, the boss's fury, and the way he was pushed out with nothing more than a few sharp words. For a moment, silence filled the room. His wife lowered her eyes, clearly worried about the future. Bills were waiting, rent was due soon, and the cupboard already looked half empty. But instead of blaming him, she reached across the table and held his hand. She told him she was proud that he chose kindness over fear, proud that he didn't walk past someone who needed help. Her voice steadied him in a way he hadn't expected. That night, as he lay in bed, his thoughts ran wild. Doubt crept in. Maybe he should have walked away, maybe he should have listened to the rules. But each time he remembered the old woman's frail smile, the way her eyes had glistened when she realized she could ride her bike again, he knew deep down he couldn't have done anything differently. Life had already taken so much from her, and refusing to help would have been a cruelty he could not live with. The house was quiet except for the soft breathing of his children asleep in the next room. He thought about them too, about what kind of example he wanted to set. He had no riches to pass down, no great inheritance, but he could show them that kindness mattered more than money. Even if the world punished him for it, he hoped they would remember their father as someone who chose the right thing when it mattered. Hours passed as he stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old roof. His mind played out different futures. Would he find another job? Would his boss spread word that he was unreliable? The uncertainty was heavy, but he kept returning to the same quiet thought. Sometimes doing good carries a cost, but it also carries a value that nothing else can match. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. The mechanic closed his eyes, forcing himself to rest. He needed strength for whatever tomorrow would bring. He reminded himself that life had always tested him, and somehow, he had always found a way forward. This time, it would be no different. He just had to hold on to faith. What he didn't know was that somewhere across town, the elderly woman he had helped was sitting at her own table, telling her daughter about the stranger who fixed her bike with such patience and respect. She described the way he never asked for payment, the way he treated her not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. Her daughter listened carefully, her expression changing with every word. That conversation would soon set in motion events the mechanic could not imagine, but for now, he knew nothing of it. He only had his small home, his worried but supportive family, and the hope that tomorrow would bring a chance to start again. As the night deepened, he turned over in his bed, unaware that the world outside was already preparing a surprise for him. A test of fate was waiting at his doorstep, and before long, the sound of engines would break the silence of his street. The next morning began like any other, but the mechanic felt a heaviness in his chest as he stepped outside his modest home. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the bite of winter, and the sky hung gray with the promise of snow. He walked to the small wooden gate at the edge of his yard and leaned against it, lost in thought. Without work to go to, his hands felt strangely idle. He had always been a man of action, someone who found comfort in fixing things. But now the day stretched ahead of him with uncertainty. Neighbors passed by on their way to work, some nodding politely, others whispering softly to each other. Word had already traveled about how he had been fired, and people carried mixed opinions. Some thought he had done the right thing. Others thought he had been foolish to cross his boss. He didn't pay much attention. His mind was on how he would keep food on the table and how long he could stretch what little money was left. Then, just as the morning quiet settled in, the low hum of engines drifted down the street. It was not the sound of ordinary cars. It was deeper, heavier, commanding. The mechanic frowned and turned toward the noise. From a distance, a line of black SUVs appeared, rolling in with perfect precision. The sunlight reflected off their polished surfaces, and for a moment, it looked as if the entire street had been taken over by something powerful and unusual. Children, playing nearby, stopped and stared, their eyes wide with wonder. Curtains shifted in windows as neighbors pulled them back to see what was happening. The sound grew louder as the SUVs slowed, their tires crunching against the frosty pavement. The mechanic's heart quickened. This was no ordinary sight, not in this neighborhood. People whispered, speculating if it was the police, a convoy for some official, or perhaps a wealthy family that had lost their way. The line of vehicles came to a stop directly in front of his small house. Engines idled in unison, their deep rumble filling the air with tension. The mechanic froze, his breath caught in his throat. Why were they here? What did this mean? His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. He glanced back toward his home, where his wife had now stepped out onto the porch, her hand clutching the railing, her face filled with confusion. One by one, the SUV doors opened. Men in sharp suits stepped out, their movements precise, their expressions unreadable. They scanned the area, their presence alone making the entire street go silent. Then, from the lead vehicle, a tall, elegant woman stepped out. She wore a dark coat that seemed to flow behind her, her posture straight and commanding. Her face was calm but carried the kind of confidence that only came from power. The mechanic stood rooted to the ground as she approached. Every step she took seemed to make the air heavier. Neighbors leaned closer to their windows, their curiosity growing. Some even stepped outside, unable to resist witnessing whatever was unfolding. The mechanic swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. He had never seen this woman before in his life, yet she looked directly at him as if she had come with a purpose. When she stopped in front of him, there was a brief silence. The only sound was the quiet purr of the SUVs waiting behind her. The mechanic, unsure of what else to do, nodded politely and asked if he could help her. She studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp but not unkind. Then, in a voice steady and clear, she told him she had heard what he had done the day before. The mechanic blinked, startled. His heart skipped a beat as her words sank in. How could she know about that? She went on, explaining that the elderly woman whose bike he had repaired was her mother. A murmur rippled through the small crowd of neighbors now gathered at the edge of the street. The mechanic felt his throat tighten, his thoughts scattering. He remembered the old woman's gentle smile, her soft voice, and the gratitude in her eyes, but he had never imagined she had a daughter like this. The woman's expression softened slightly as she looked at him. She said her mother had come home the previous evening with tears in her eyes, speaking of the kind man who had helped her when she was helpless. The daughter had listened, and she was moved by the story, so much so that she had decided to come herself. And when she came, she didn't come alone. The mechanic glanced at the SUVs again, realizing this was no ordinary family. Whoever this woman was, she held power and influence that stretched far beyond his small world. And now, for reasons he could not yet grasp, that power had arrived right at his doorstep. The street buzzed with whispers, neighbors straining to hear. The mechanic stood frozen, caught between disbelief and anxiety, wondering what this revelation would mean for him. What had begun as a simple act of kindness was now unfolding into something far greater, something he could not have imagined when he first decided to fix that old bike. And in that moment, as the woman prepared to speak again, he realized his life was about to change forever. The mechanic stood silently, his rough hands hanging at his sides, unsure how to respond. The woman in front of him carried herself with a grace and power that seemed far removed from his small world. The convoy of black SUVs gleamed behind her, a sight so unusual in his neighborhood that even passing strangers had stopped to watch. Children clutched their parents' hands, and neighbors leaned out of windows, whispering about what was happening. The mechanic felt as if the entire street had turned into a stage, and he was at the center of it. The woman looked into his eyes and began to speak again. She told him that the elderly woman whose bike he had repaired was not just anyone, she was her mother, a woman who had lived quietly for years without revealing much about her family's wealth or influence. She explained how her mother had returned home the previous evening, deeply moved by the kindness of a stranger who had not asked for anything in return. Her mother's voice, she said, had been filled with both tears and pride as she described how the mechanic had treated her with respect and dignity. The mechanic shifted uncomfortably, his modesty making it hard for him to accept such attention. He said softly that it had been nothing, just a small repair, something anyone with tools could have done. But the woman shook her head firmly. She told him it wasn't the repair that mattered, it was the choice he had made. At a time when he could have turned her mother away, when he knew the rules of his workplace forbade such actions, he still chose kindness. That, she said, revealed more about his character than any job ever could. The mechanic's wife stood on the porch, her eyes wide, hardly believing what she was hearing. His children peeked out from behind her, their faces lit with a mixture of confusion and awe. For years, they had seen their father work hard without recognition, often returning home with tired shoulders and empty pockets. And now, before their very eyes, powerful people were acknowledging his worth. The elegant woman turned slightly and gestured to the men standing by the SUVs. One of them stepped forward, carrying a small folder. She explained that her family owned several businesses, and that they always needed people they could trust. She said her mother insisted that someone like him, someone who valued people more than money, deserved a chance far greater than the one he had lost. With steady hands, the man opened the folder and revealed documents inside. The woman explained that they were offering him not just a job, but a position of trust in their company, along with fair pay that could secure his family's future. The mechanic's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the papers, then at the fleet of SUVs, then back at the woman, still wondering if this was all real. The neighbors murmured loudly now, their whispers turning to astonishment. Some could not believe that the same man who had been fired so cruelly the day before was now being honored by people of influence. Others smiled quietly, realizing that his kindness had not been wasted after all. The mechanic hesitated, his humility keeping him from responding right away. He asked softly why they would do all this for someone like him. The woman's answer was simple. She said her family believed that the measure of a person was not in their wealth or position, but in their actions when no one was watching. His act of kindness, she said, had reminded them of values that even the richest often forget. Tears welled in the mechanic's eyes as the weight of the moment sank in. His wife stepped forward, her own eyes shining, and gently took his hand. His children clung to his side, smiling with pride. For the first time in many years, he felt truly seen, not as a worker, not as someone replaceable, but as a man whose choices mattered. The elegant woman gave him a final nod of respect before returning to her vehicle. One by one, the SUVs began to move again, their engines rumbling as the convoy slowly pulled away. The street returned to its ordinary quiet, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The mechanic stood at the gate of his home, still holding his wife's hand, his children at his side, and a folder of documents pressed to his chest. That morning, he had woken up with no job, no certainty, and no idea how he would keep going. But by noon, his life had shifted in a way he could never have imagined. A simple choice to help an elderly woman had brought unexpected rewards. It was proof that kindness, even when punished at first, had the power to return in ways greater than anyone could predict. The lesson lingered in the air, whispered by neighbors and carried in the hearts of his children. One act of compassion can change everything.